Good morning. I hope everyone's doing well today. We're going to move into chapter 10 and to chapter 11 and go through a lot of chapter 11 today here in the book of Daniel. It's the longest chapter in the book, and so imagine, based on keeping this at least to an hour, we're only going to get probably about 3/4 of the way through, maybe a little further, maybe not. Just depends on how it goes and what kind of thoughts pop into my head as we go through this. Some things to think about here as we go through this. We're probably in the 2nd century still, probably around 160 BC or BCE, depending on where you're coming from. And we're going to start reading through a lot of information related to what we refer to as the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, which are two different people groups that were quite powerful during this time, and they spent a lot of time fighting each other, fighting over the land of Judah, and of course causing a lot of grief and issues for the Jewish people. A big part of this will be someone we've already talked about before in chapters 7, 8, and 9 as Antiochus IV. He was a very oppressive ruler. He was a huge threat to the Jewish people, to the Jewish way of life during this time, and was causing all kinds of problems to him. A lot of this part of Daniel is talking about the oppression and the issues that the Jewish people were dealing with. This is post-exile, of course, period. The Jewish people are back in Jerusalem. Some people refer to this as the Second Temple period. It's just one of those times where even though they were back in their land, they were still not fully a free people, mainly because of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and we may refer to the Seleucids along here as the Syrians. You'll hear that today. We're fighting against each other, and of course, pretty much Judah got in the way, and they were trying to, take over that land. And then, of course, with Antiochus IV, who will also be known, as you see through here, as the king of the north. So the Seleucids are coming from the north, and the Ptolemies are coming from the south, and you'll see those references in here as well. Like I said, we've heard of Antiochus IV before. He was in chapter 7 as the fourth beast, in chapter 8 as the little horn, and in chapter 9 as the one who invaded the temple. And again, we'll get a little bit more of the temple invasion throughout this as well. A lot of what some modern historical critical scholars, that's a long name for a group of people, believe that what we read in Daniel 2 through 39, of verses 2 through 39 here in chapter 11, is a prophecy after the fact. And so it's something that happened, was written afterwards, kind of as a review. And that we'll see through the rest of this chapter from verses 40 and 45 is a future or a genuine prophecy of the demise of Antiochus, as well as some additional information related to that. We know this to be a prophecy because of a lot of the symbolism that is built into chapter 11. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism throughout Daniel, of course. But it also becomes a little bit more vague in its information and how it's presented, and does not really tie extremely close to a lot of what was historically recorded about Antiochus, as well as some of the other people. Now, there's a lot of extra biblical text about, of course, this time period, and a lot of what we see in Daniel and how the symbolism is identified and reviewed and interpreted ties very closely to what we see in the history books, and we'll see a little bit of that today. A few other things that we want to think about here is that when we come closer to the end of this book, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Maccabean revolt. And I've mentioned that before in other chapters as we've gone through Daniel. And the thing about the Maccabean revolt is it was a huge issue not a huge issue, it was a huge time for the people of Judah. This was where they became free to a point. They actually started having their own kings after the Maccabean revolt for a while. That never went well for them for the next pretty much 100 years until the Romans took over. But there is some freedom with the Maccabean revolt. And the reason we bring that up is because Many of you may or may not be familiar with the First and Second Maccabees, which tells a lot of what we know about here. It's what we'd refer to, at least in the Protestant Church, as the Apocrypha. And there's some really good information in there, especially about this time period and what Daniel's trying to explain in here, and about specifically to the Maccabean revolt. We talked a little bit about the revolt last week in chapter 10, actually a pretty good amount. And then this week we're going to talk a little bit more because it's very significant. A few other things, there's the questions that we get related to, well, if this is the book of Daniel or a book written by Daniel, and now we're 400 something years after he's already left this earth, how could it possibly be Daniel? And some of the theories around this is that, well, there's a prophecy that was given to him, and that he then, that the people are now living in, and it's now being written about. Possibly that could be it. Most likely it's a pseudonym author. And it would be pretty typical to have that during this time. And the reason that is they would do that to protect writers when it was times of danger, such as this time in which they're living in. You could imagine that if you were writing about what Antiochus was doing to the Jewish people, as well as some of the other kings that were doing to the Jewish people, the person writing it about it would not be safe, so they would possibly use a different name. Another thing is that Daniel was a very well-respected sage. He had a lot of people following him, respecting him. They knew who he was. And so this is almost like a tribute to Daniel. It's very consistent with what he was writing about anyways, about the hope for the Jewish people in times of oppression. So that's very significant here. It also would help the writer who's writing this to get some, gain some respect in the community, to be able to be someone who's set up and set apart from other writers. This also happens as a way of just telling of how prophecies were told during this time and how they were written about as well. And like I said, this is not abnormal at all for Second Temple literature to have a pseudonym author. And it is also not abnormal for this sort of literature to have what we're about to see here, the interpretation of history in the form of a revelation from an angel. So what is being revealed here, the revelatory information coming from an angel, is pretty typical for Second Temple literature. One thing we don't want to lose focus here is that, is it a pseudonym author? Is it Daniel originally? I mean, that's really not the focus here, but we need to really think about what the intent of the author is. One of them is being able to show a people group how they will be able to endure turmoil, pain, doubt during this time, but because they have eyes of faith, the faith of looking towards God, towards Yahweh, their God, to keep them not safe, but to know, to allow them to have hope inside of them, to know that God will eventually deliver them. Also, you be able to read this through, we'll be able to focus on that empires will be defeated. The horrible, oppressive empires that they were dealing with for hundreds of years will be defeated. They also know that what they think to be here on earth is unstoppable. God is in control, and within his time, things will happen. And we'll see that multiple times in chapter 11, where someone was put into power based on a decreed amount of time that God has provided them to be in power. And ultimately, all the empires that try to destroy Israel, at least in this case here, Israel or Judah as we know it here, will be destroyed, or at least subdued by God. So it's something to keep in mind. So the focus here is what the intent of the author is. We could debate for hours about who the real author is. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter as much as what the intent of the author is as we go into this. So let's look into, let's read a little bit of chapter 11 and get going here. And you'll get a little bit of history as we start here in the first couple of verses, and then we're going to start going into the message that the angel is trying to provide Daniel and the people of Judah during this time. So I'm going to read chapter 11, 1 through 5. Actually 1 through 4, and then we'll talk a little bit about that, and then go on as we go through this. So chapter 11, verse 1. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And I will tell you the truth, behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them, as soon as he becomes strong through his riches. He will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece, and a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to be his own descendants, nor according to his authority, which he wielded for his sovereignty, will be uprooted and given to the others beside them. What we're seeing here is a very brief overview of the Persian emperors that will be coming into power and their eventual fall to Alexander the Great. That's what we see there in verse 2. And then what we're going to see from there is what happens after Alexander the Great and all his great glory that he finds or is able to accomplish. He does not survive much longer after his great reign over and actually over his... Yeah, let's call it that. Let's call it his great reign over this entire region. It does not last long at all. Instead, here what we're going to see here is the rise of what we refer to as the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Before we get too far along here, we're going to look at a few other things and kind of break that down, because you have this. Well, let's get into it. So there's a historical rendering here that we need to go through here. The focus here, at least these first couple verses here, is on the predecessor to Antiochus IV, Antiochus III, Antiochus III the Great. Antiochus IV was referred to as Antiochus IV. The Epiphanes, people called him the Epiphanes, but Epiphanes was his name as well. We'll get a little bit why they changed his name here in a minute. Antiochus III was the one who solidified the Seleucid power over the region that for the most part contained Judah. He was also not as oppressive as his brother, the fourth, but he was quite grand in what he did, and for the most part he was pretty excessive, very grandiose in how he lived and the life in which he lived, but fortunately for the Jewish people was not as oppressive as his older or younger brother, the fourth, which we'll get into about how the fourth got into power here in a little bit. We learn much of this history through Jewish, Christian, and Roman authors. A lot of what we see here, like I said earlier, in 11 has come from other writers as well. Like I said, Jewish, Christian, Roman authors. I mentioned earlier 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Polybius wrote about it. Josephus, who you've probably heard of pretty regularly if you follow any sort of Old Testament history, as well as some New Testament. And then Livy was also a writer, historical writer of the time. And then of course, Jerome. He was much later on. He was probably 4th, 5th century AD when he started writing a lot about this history. So this group of writings about this time period was the 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So 1st century BC all the way through about the 5th century AD is so there's a lot of good historical evidence about what was going on during this time. The time of the vision is during the reign of Cyrus, who's a Persian, so it is fitting to start here as we look at the end of the Persian rule and the beginning of the Greek rule through Alexander the Great, beginning with Alexander the Great. So the Persians are starting to lose their power at this point, and now the Greeks are starting to take over. It's hard to determine who the 3 kings are. They are Persian, but there is debate about who it is. It could be a group ranging from Cyrus to Darius III, who is the final Persian king who fell to Alexander the Great. The use of 3 and 4 that we see here in this verse may be symbolic, or it could be a literary device that shows God's intervention in human affairs. We've seen that in other chapters as well. Once you get to 4 of something, God would intervene. There would be some sort of decisive judgment, and that seems probably what Alexander the Great did against the Persian people. So this is not a new pattern to have 3 and then 4, 3 sometimes meaning complete. 4, of course, some sort of divisive action or judgment is about to take place. We do learn that all the wealth and privilege of Persia will not keep it from being taken out by the Greeks, and that's what we kind of see here in the first in verse 2 of chapter 11. So there's a lot going on here related to the transition from the Persians to the Greeks, a lot of history going on here, how Alexander the Great came in, who were the kings, and what they looked like, and some of the symbolism tied up to that. In verse 3 here, we get a little bit more about Alexander the Great, the warrior king or mighty king, depending on your translation of what you would see in there. He was no better, as we see here, than the Persian kings, and he pretty much, for the most part, did what he pleases. It wasn't like he was this benefactor, any person of benevolence or anything came in to help. He was just as ruthless as all the other rulers along the way. So he, along with many of the other kings that we'll be reading about before and after him, for the most part lived a pretty shameful legacy when you really kind of look at it and everything. As we go into verse 4, but as soon as he has risen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points. This is after his great wins, after his great domination over the entire region. So most likely it was from what we know as modern-day India to Asia Minor, which is parts of modern-day Turkey. I mean, it's a huge, huge region that Alexander the Great had taken over. It does not go well for him. He has some heirs who are supposed to take over, but they failed pretty miserably in leading the land that he conquered to be in turmoil, and so there's many problems with that. So you had Erhedehes, the illegitimate son of Alexander's father, Philip II, and then you had Alexander IV, who was the son born to Roxana after Alexander had died. Both of these people, Philip and Alexander IV, were supposed to inherit the land, but failed in doing so. Instead, there were 4 generals who we'll talk about even more here in a second, but there were 4 generals who divided up the land. And so you see this idea here going into, in verse 4, broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not of his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty had been uprooted. So his heirs were not able to do it. So these 4 generals, as you represent here as the 4 points, came in and separated the land or the region which he conquered into 4 different areas. They are known. They had an official name. They were known as the Diadochi, and they were for the most part very powerful generals that worked with or served under Alexander the Great, and once he passed away, became opportunists and decided to split up this land. As you can imagine, they did not get along well with each other, especially when you talk about the Seleucids, who are a big part of this, and the Ptolemies, which we'll see here in a second. Anytime you see the 4 points or the 4 winds, you know that it encompassed pretty much what they knew as the world at that point. It was a huge amount of space, so that's just a symbolism for that. Pretty much encompassed everything. The 4 corners of the world were ruled by these 4 people. So for the 4 kings, because I know you're just dying to know who they are, you had Greece and Macedonia go to a general by the name of Cassander. We know some about him, but he's not really part of this story. Thrace went to Lysimachus, which is always a fun name to say. The 2 major ones that we're really going to be focusing on is Babylonia and northern Syria. Went to Antigonus, later replaced by Seleucus I, who then eventually we end up with Antiochus IV, which was, of course, was a huge burden to the Jewish people. So Seleucus I, which is where we get the name Seleucids from, and then Egypt and southern area. So we have, first of all, Babylonia and northern Syria. That's the northern king, or for the most part, the northern kingdom, not northern kingdom as in Israel, but the northern king. So he's the northern king, and then the southern king that we're going to be reading about here in a little bit is Ptolemy the First Soter. They always have such fun names. But anyways, he had Egypt and southern Syria, which contained Palestine, which of course contains Judah. So that's where a lot of the battle is taking place, or will be taking place as we read through this. All 4 of these are in some way depicted through the rest of the vision that Daniel is getting from the angel here. And it, for the most part, shows that Alexander was no longer had any sort of power, after his great campaigns and wars and battles and everything he had done, that he was going to hand off to his heirs is now being divided up by four generals, who then, of course, start fighting each other. And like I said, the main focus going forward was going to be the battle between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So let's read a little bit further into here and give us a little more context. I'm going to be here in verse 5 of chapter 11. Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion, and his domain will be a great dominion indeed. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain in his power, but she will be given up, along with those who brought her in, the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the kings of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of symbolism going on through this as well, symbolizing these two powerful nations, or two powerful, let's call them nations right now, or people groups or generals who are leading these groups, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So first of all, you can see starting right off, we start with the Ptolemies as the king of the south, and the Seleucids as the king of the north. The prince referred to as the Seleucids, who will eventually become more powerful than the king of the south. So the north will eventually be more powerful than the south. So this is a reference to Ptolemy I Soter and Seleucus I, where Seleucus I will eventually overpower Ptolemy. Seleucus I lost Babylonia land to Antigonus. And so we remember earlier on, Antigonus was the first general, and then Seleucus I took over. And later fought as an ally with Ptolemy against Antigonus's son, Demetrius. What you'll notice here is that there are some times where the Ptolemies and Seleucids will ally with each other in order to take out maybe another possibly burgeoning empire, or especially when you look at the Egyptians. So you'll see that they'll eventually ally. Those do not last long, typically because they're purely out of personal gain, and so there's really, it's not a true alliance, but it's something that they kind of do as a way of convenience. Fortunately, alliances like that do not happen that way. Obviously, everyone has the best interest of the other person. So this is old history. Nowadays, we know that doesn't happen, right? So, anyways, as we go forward here, we see that Seleucus the first, or Seleucus I, regained Babylon and eventually gained even more land, and became even more powerful than his once ally Ptolemy. And then at one point, as we go a little bit further deeper into this, Seleucus and Ptolemy's alliance ended over a fight over who? Judah. They both wanted the land where Judah existed, so their alliance ended. And then from here, we're going to see an ongoing battle over Judah. So the people where the place where the people of Jerusalem existed is what we're going to see as we continue to go in here. So verse 5 sets up verse 6 and 7, and then we go into another generation of battle between. Now we have Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, against Antiochus II, Thos. Ptolemy II offers his daughter Bernice to Antiochus II for marriage, and this is, of course, to form another alliance, which, of course, does not last long. To do this, Antiochus would have to divorce his wife Laodice, which leads to, later on, a time of murderous revenge. I mean, this is just so intriguing. I mean, if you're into stories about geopolitics and intriguing events related to who is who's on whose side at any given time, who's going to take over what side. I mean, it's almost like Risk. It's nuts what's going on here. All the kind of inner workings and interplay and behind the scenes stuff that's going on here. So, anyways, we'll come back to Leodius here in a second. But after Antiochus II died, Leodius had Bernice's two sons, and all their attendants killed because, of course, she was pretty upset with Bernice. Some people would refer to her Bernice, but I'm just calling her Bernice. The reason it is because she was no longer the wife. She was divorced. Bernice was now the king's wife, had two sons and some attendants. Leodius kills her once Antiochus II died. This, of course, why would they do that? Why did they do that back then? To ensure that the heirs of the throne, which would have been Antiochus II's sons, making sure that they would not someday take over the throne. But after this murderous rampage, Ptolemy's the second son, it's not over yet, Ptolemy's the second son, his name was, as you can imagine, Ptolemy III, Euergetes, sought revenge to go after a branch, as you can see there in verses 6 and 7, a branch from her roots. So he avenged his sister Bernice by killing Leodice. And then Ptolemy III then went on a land takeover spree by taking much of Seleucus II's, king of the North's land. And then he invaded other parts of Upper Asia. He returned to Egypt without retaining any control of the land he took over. So he had kind of a somewhat successful campaign up into the north, but then ended up not really obtaining or maintaining or retaining any of that land upon his return. Now let's look at the next set of verses. We'll go verses 8 through 12 here. Also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt, and he on his part will retain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep it on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. The king of the south will be enraged to go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. This is not at all confusing. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fail, yet he will not prevail. So this continues on. The continued back and forth between these two kingdoms continue on as we go in through and through verse 12. So pretty much everything that Ptolemy III had captured as spoils of war had given him great wealth, made him even more powerful. He even became known as a different name as Euergetes I, which means the benefactor. So he had became great wealth, doing very well for himself. And then if you go into verse 9, it continues, the back and forth continues. Seleucus II tried to steal back some of the land from Ptolemy III. There in verse 9, remember this is the battles between the Seleucids in the north, and Seleucus in the north and Ptolemy in the south. So this is your north and south thing that you see here in verse 9, and of course in some of these other verses. So this was a 2-year campaign, limited success. Mainly just a lot of people died. Mainly a lot of his soldiers died. And this isn't the only time a lot of his soldiers and a lot of people die. That's going to continue to happen as we go through the rest of Daniel 11. The sons that you see here in verses 10 through 12, his sons will mobilize. They're the sons of Seleucus II. It was, of course, Seleucus III and Antiochus III. Seleucus III was murdered after about 3 years of being in rule. And then at that point, Antiochus III takes the reins and is in power at that point for the Seleucids during this time. Antiochus III, I believe his full name was Antiochus III the Great. He was known as the Great because of all of his military successes, and he had some really significant battles and significant success in Palestine and in Phoenicia, where he defeated the Ptolemies, probably around 218, 219 BC. That's what we see happening there in verse 10. As we go into verse 11, we now get to meet Ptolemy the Fourth, the Philopator, who then counterattacked Antiochus. Both had very large armies, and to put this into perspective, Ptolemy had 70,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and 73 elephants. The fascinating part is the elephants. But Antiochus had an even more powerful army. He had 63,000 infantry, which is a little less infantry than Ptolemy had, but he had 6,000 cavalry and 102 elephants. So even more elephants and, of course, 1,000 more cavalry. The battle they fought, if you're just really into history, you could look up the battle, was in Raphia, which is in present-day Palestine, and Ptolemy won this battle. It is recorded that Antiochus probably lost about 17,000 soldiers in this battle, so it was a great loss for Antiochus during this time. It was a relatively good success for Ptolemy during this time, but he also lost thousands of troops, especially when he was trying to again go into Egypt and take and cause some additional problems there. Antiochus also was trying to go into Egypt, and he failed. Ptolemy the Fourth, who was in power at that point, and actually in power over Egypt, that was one of the regions that they were in power of, kept hold of Egypt, was able to make a little bit of progress into the Seleucids' land, but then was not able to retain that land. And then in verse 12, you'll see there, he shall not prevail. And that's a reference to Ptolemy IV having some success for the Ptolemies, but at the end of the day was not able to prevail fully over the Seleucids, the Seleucid Empire. As we transition now to the change of power from the Ptolemies were kind of the more powerful of the two groups up until this point. And from now verses 13 through 35, we're going to see that the Seleucids are now the ones who are coming more into power. So we're in a transition phase as we go through this. So we're going to read. I'm going to go ahead and read from 13 through 19. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years, he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times, many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to take a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land. If you've probably heard beautiful land before, if you've been following along and reading in Daniel, beautiful land is Palestine, or Judah is the place where the people of the Jewish people live. And so there's more to that. With destruction in his hand. He will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter, another daughter being traded, if you go back to, or that's not the right word, handed in marriage for an alliance, as we saw earlier on in verses 6. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So he will turn his face again. This is the third time his face has been set or turned in the last 3 verses. So he will turn his face toward the fortress on his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more. All right. So going forward here from verse 13, and going 13 through, of course, 19, you can see there's additional intrigue, additional geopolitics going on here with these two major empires going after each other and trying to prevail over the other one. So verse 13, this is again the Seleucids, the king of the north. He'll raise a great military, even larger military than he had in the past, and he'll return and try to take out the Ptolemies. And we'll have some successful campaigns in Asia Minor. Like I said, that's parts of modern day Turkey and Persia. And this is it's a significant amount of time. It's about 13 years, 217 to 204 BC. This will give him a little bit of encouragement and a little bit of bravado, and he'll want to then try to take out Judah again. We're now about 202 BC, and Antiochus III will again try to invade the Ptolemaic territories. And so, of course, that includes Judah as well as Egypt, which is what we're about to see here in a second. Ptolemy IV has died at this point, and Ptolemy V, Epiphanes, was now crowned king. While this was going on, Antiochus attacked. So during this transition, I think Antiochus saw an opportunity to attack, and so what he did is Antiochus attacked Phoenicia and Palestine, and around 201 BC. And the fortress in Gaza, which is what was being referenced here, had fallen to the Syrians and the Seleucids. That's all what we're seeing going on in verse 13 and some a little bit history and background during that time period. In verse 14, we're starting to move a little bit south. So the king of the south, many will rise up against the king of the south. And so what we're seeing here, these are the kings of Egypt, which of course at the time were under Ptolemaic Empire rule. Those who rose up were Antiochus and Philip V the Macedon, or was he an animal? No, Philip V Macedon from Macedonia, who is also an ally, of course, with Antiochus. These two were coming in, and they were coming into, you'll see here, the violent ones. I'll probably, depending on your translation, could also be violent men, or also be translated as probably originally as sons of the violent one. Typically, the reason I bring this up is typically that word means robbers and murderers, but in this case is related to the Jewish people who aided Antiochus. There were several Jewish people, Hellenistic Jews and others, that were not sticking to their Jewish faith. And so a lot of the story, of course, is between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, but one thing that's kind of going on in the background here, as we read through here, there's some references that the author makes here, is that there were a decent amount of Jewish people who were trying to be on the side of whoever was winning at any given time. And so at this point, what we're seeing here is that the Jewish people were helping Antiochus and Philip V, Macedon, go up against the Egyptians. And what happened then to them is that when this failed, they were then punished by the Ptolemaic government. So the violent ones, of course, could refer to Antiochus and Philip V, but also refers to the Jewish people who aided Antiochus during this time. That's what we see there in verse 14. As we look into verse 15, the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. This is, again, things are just getting worse by the minute. I mean, this ongoing attack after attack after attack. It's just nonstop. Things go from bad to worse as we go through here, it's just not good. During this time, we're probably around 199 BC, so the early part of the second century here. Antiochus III defeats Scopas at a place known as Caesarea Philippi. It's known as the Battle of Panium. You could always want to go look that one up. And I know that you've probably heard of Caesarea Philippi at some point along the way if you've read a little bit of the New Testament and other parts of Scripture. So that's a big reference point for you to look at there. Scopas, who was defeated, like I said, by Antiochus III, attempted to seek refuge in Egypt, but a famine in the region forced him to surrender a year later, so he was not did not do well for him. As we go into verse 16, with Scopas and the Egyptians no longer in power, Antiochus took over Phoenicia and Palestine. This is known, as you have heard before, in chapter, like I said earlier, chapter 8 and 9. That's the beautiful land that you see there in verse 16. So if you wanted to reference back to chapter 8 of Daniel, verse 9, you'll be able to see a similar sort of reference. And now this beautiful land, this land of Palestine and Phoenicia, at this time will be part of the Syrian Empire. Which what this, of course, does is set the oppressive rule of our soon-to-be king, Antiochus IV. Antiochus III entered Jerusalem in 198 BC, and he punished those who were opposed to him, which there were many, but were also greeted by many Jewish people who were very happy to see him and looked at him as a deliverer and benefactor to the people, not having any idea what was about to happen to them. They thought that it was great that this guy had come. He'd come to save them, help them, but not knowing that 23 years later, Antiochus IV would take power and would be leading to one of the worst periods in all of Jewish history for the Jewish people. So it is very bad. We know that there have been extremely hard times for the Jewish people, but this is still known as probably one of the worst times for those of the Jewish faith when Antiochus IV takes power. And like I said, it's going to be about 23 years later from the time Antiochus III had entered Jerusalem. As we go into verse 17, there's a peace alliance that is forced between the Syrians and the Egyptian kings. The hope was that peace with Egypt would keep the Romans away, or from trying to attack the Seleucids during this time period. Even though Seleucids were pretty powerful, the Romans were starting to become a powerful force. Were starting to come into their own right, had a significant and legitimate amount of power. And so the hope was that if the Syrians, Seleucids, same people, could form this alliance with the Egyptians, the Romans would stay away at least for a while. So how this all play out? We get another daughter who is provided as a wife as part of this alliance. So Antiochus III gave his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V as his wife. This would hopefully lead for more control for Antiochus. Instead, she loves Ptolemy more than and turns against Antiochus. So Antiochus's hope of his daughter turning Ptolemy towards their desires and their needs and their wants, instead the opposite happens. Cleopatra actually sides with Ptolemy V instead. Again, this is a similar arrangement that we saw earlier on with Ptolemy II, where he used his daughter Bernice to forge an alliance with Antiochus II. Both attempts, as we have seen, or will be seen, are futile. As we look into verses 18 and 19, we get a prophecy of Antiochus' defeat and his eventual end. There in verse 18, having taken out the Egyptians in 197 BC, Antiochus turns to the coast of the Mediterranean. That's what we see there. So he will turn his face. This is the third time, like I said, he's turned his face. And where he's heading towards the Mediterranean Sea, or the coast of the Mediterranean. And after some success as he goes along the coast there, the Romans, who I just mentioned just briefly, teamed up with some of the Greek allies and took out the Syrians, forcing them to flee back to Asia Minor. So that is, of course, a huge issue there. As we move forward here, and as Antiochus is leaving, they followed him away. 30,000 Roman soldiers followed Antiochus into Asia and defeated the 70,000 Syrian soldiers at the Battle of Magnesia, which is near Smyrna. Again, probably a place you've heard of as you've read through the Bible. While this is happening there in verse 18, so this is back and forth between verses 18 and 19 here in chapter 11. But a commander will put a stop to his scorn against his. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. This commander is a Roman commander. He's a Roman officer by the name of Lucius Cornelius Scipio, who beat Antiochus at the Battle of Magnesia. And he, for the most part, forces Antiochus to surrender and pay tribute to Rome. Antiochus III then heads back to his own land, where he was eventually murdered. And that's what we see here in verse 19 of his own land. It's a place known as Elmaeus, which was a province in Persia, which had the temple of Baal. And what Antiochus would try to do is he was trying to steal from this temple to pay off the Romans. And that's where it went really south for him. No pun intended. And he was, eventually, like I said, murdered and not really able to pay tribute. Let's look at verse, we're going to verse 20, and we'll run all the way through. Let's go through verse 26 here and see where we go from there. Actually, I'm going to stop at 25, and then we'll continue after that. Then in his place, one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. In his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been confirmed, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Those of you who are following along probably know who this despicable person is, and I bet you'd venture a guess about right now. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. Keep that in mind. Only for a time. And that is what a time that God would decree or God would allow for. That will happen again, and you've heard that before through prophecies, through Daniel, and through other areas as well. Only for a time. We always have to remember in the back of all of this, God is in control. God is allowing things to happen. God has decreed some things to happen, but it's within his time frame, within his time period. Verse 25. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Let's stop right there and start looking from verse 20 through 25. So after Antiochus III is murdered, his son Seleucus IV Philopator will take over. You've heard all these names before, but the only difference is the four. So it's amazing. I find it innate that the naming of children and heirs during this time was just unique. It's probably the best way to look at it. So anyways, the Seleucids, they still owe tribute to Rome via the Treaty of Apamea. And so, again, one of those things, you go back in some extra biblical text and read all about the Treaty of Apamea. It's fascinating. And he needs to figure out how to pay his taxes. So he sends an oppressor or an official to go to Jerusalem. That's what we're seeing here in verse 20, to raid its treasuries. And so we meet a guy by the name of Heliodorus, who is the finance minister for the Seleucids and works very closely with Seleucus IV. And he failed. He failed at going down to Jerusalem and getting the funding that they needed. And depending on what extra biblical text you read, I believe it's in Maccabees 2 as well, is that there is some sort of divine intervention. Even an angel may have came down and intervened and kept him from taking anything from the temple there in verse 20. So within a few days, he'll be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle, but most likely through divine intervention, or an angel had come and kept him and intervened him from being able to do anything. Well, just a little bit more on Heliodorus. He eventually poisons Seleucus IV along with a few conspirators. So he and a few other people conspire against Seleucus. It's hard to believe, based on how all this is playing out, that someone would conspire against somebody else. And his hope was that he would someday gain the throne. Seleucus IV's son was to take on the throne, but was outflanked by Heliodorus and eventually by Antiochus IV, who became king. So Heliodorus defeated, well, first of all, he kills Seleucus IV. He then outflanks, you have to go look back in the history books exactly what that means, but he, for the most part, outdoes the heir, who should have been the fifth, to it, and then eventually Antiochus takes over. So in verse 21, Seleucus dies in 175. His younger brother is his younger brother. So Seleucus IV, his younger brother is Antiochus IV. Sorry. And so you have another son of Antiochus III. So Seleucus IV, Antiochus IV were both sons of Antiochus III. He is known as the despicable person that we see there, verse in 21. Also, you may, depending on your translation could be contemptible person. And this is, of course, is based on the Jewish vantage point that he is a monster. He kills thousands and was the greatest threat, like I said, to the threat of the worship of God in all of Israel's history. He was a monster. It's horrible what he did to people. Like I said, I think if I said very earlier on, he referred to himself as, he eventually adds this part to his name, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, which means the manifest one. He truly thought he was manifested by the gods or brought to life by the gods and was in fact a god himself. But of course, the Jewish people who did not like him referred to him as Epiphanes, which means madman. So Antiochus IV, madman. I would say that's probably more true to his character than, of course, being divine. The honor of kingship of royalty, as we see here, was not for him. Was not officially his. The rightful owner would have been Demetrius I Soter, who was being held hostage in Rome, which then allowed Antiochus IV to seize power. So Demetrius, who was not there, held up, was the one supposed to be in power, but we see here that it is not him, it's Antiochus instead. What we see here also is that Antiochus came during you see here, he will come in a time of tranquility, verse in 21. It was a time of false security, a time of false tranquility. The people, so for example, Heliodorus probably felt pretty good after killing the Seleucus IV. He probably felt pretty good about it. He's going to be in power. So he had kind of a false sense of security. He probably felt pretty safe about where he was and where his standing, but obviously he wasn't. And the same goes for Antiochus IV. The thing about Antiochus, and this is what a lot of historians will say about him, is that he was a political genius. He knew how to play the politics game. He knew how to conspire. He knew how to get his way. He was also apparently very charming with those he wanted to be charming with. For those who wanted power along with him or wanted parts of his power or pieces of power that he was able to get for them, he was a great guy. But only in that way. He was, for everyone else, a horrible monster. And so let's go into verses 22 and 23. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. We're now around 169 BC. Ptolemy the sixth, Philometor, tried to get the Palestinian land back from Antiochus, but failed miserably. So that didn't go well. So you have this option coming up. Ptolemy was captured and held hostage. He is known as the Prince of the Covenant that you see there at the end of verse 22 here in chapter 11. Why is he known as that? He agreed to become an ally with Antiochus if the Syrians would help Ptolemy get his throne back in Egypt. The throne had been taken over by Ptolemy's the sixth younger brother, Ptolemy the seventh, Euergetes the second. Isn't this great? I mean, it's literally Ptolemy 7, Euergetes second. I mean, can they not come up with anything else? I know there's a reason they do that, and I completely understand that. But it's fascinating, and it can cause a little bit of confusion unless you're really, really paying close attention to this. So Antiochus agreed to this, mainly just for his own benefit. He really could care less about the Ptolemies or anything like that, but mainly he wanted to get a foothold into Egypt. So he agreed. And Ptolemy was able to gain the throne, but later allied with his brother against Antiochus and defeated the Syrians. And so Ptolemy gets together with his brother. They go against Antiochus. They defeat the Syrians right on the Egyptian border and removes Antiochus' troops from an area known as Pelusium. As we go into verse 24, Antiochus again feels pretty secure with where he is and his rule. It's again another time of what he feels as tranquility. And so he went after even more riches in that part of the region, probably also known as the richest parts. In original Hebrew, it would have been the richest parts would be referred to as the fat ones, but that's just how that would translate directly from Hebrew into English. Richest parts is probably your nicer way of saying that. So he attacked Egypt, Judea, and other provinces in the region during this time, even more, trying to take over more power. He divides the spoil of his victory with those who followed him. So that could have been, of course, other Syrians, other Syrian leaders that he reported up to him, governors, satraps. But it was also Jewish people who had become, people who wanted to follow him to kind of ride his coattails. But he had great plans to take out the mighty fortress of Egypt, but his success was a limited time, as what we see there at the end of verse 24, because it says, but only for a time. Again, only as decreed by God. So what we see here is no matter what his wealth or his military power was, his military prowess and political cunning, no matter how good he was at that, he could not exceed the limits that God had placed before him, no matter what. And it goes, that I believe is true to this day. It's been true throughout all of history and continues to be true today. So let's start looking a little bit deeper into this. We're going to go into verse 25 through 28. Now let's do that. So he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the kings of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army, but he will not stand for schemes will be devised against him. Verse 26. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed. For the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. The holy covenant being the Jewish people. Verses 25 and 26, we get a reference back to Antiochus' first campaign against Egypt back in 169 BC. Verse 25 also is a reference to his victory over Ptolemy down there in Egypt. So where you see courage against the king of the south with a large army, that's that reference. Schemes or plots are devised against him. And these are against actually Ptolemy. And Antiochus has his own plans against him. There's disloyal subjects in Egypt who are trying to take Ptolemy out. And then in verse 26, he has some bad advice from his advisors. What we see here is these advisors of his. So advisors were able to come in, of course, and they were people that he trusted, people that could come in and eat the choice foods, drink the choice drinks. Those were the people who would eventually cause his demise, because they unwisely urged him to take back Syria and Palestine and which, of course, as you can imagine, Antiochus did not appreciate and caused some significant problems for Ptolemy. So going into 27, as for both kings, so Ptolemy the sixth was being held prisoner, and Ptolemy the seventh, at this point, the seventh, there's that many of them so far, took the throne. This led the sixth, Ptolemy the sixth, and Antiochus, the two kings that we see here, to temporarily become allies in hopes of retaking the Egyptian throne from Ptolemy the seventh. Neither one were planning on keeping their promises. This is, of course, all about deception. This idea here in verse 27 is very significant culturally to that time period, where they speak lies to each other at the same table. Near East cultures during this time, a time at the table when you made a promise to somebody was sacred. And so it was obviously the worst kind of deception that you could do against somebody if you made a promise at the table while eating and did not keep that promise. It was, of course, very deceptive. And so that's what we're seeing here, speaking lies to each other at the same table. And of course, they weren't what they were doing it for themselves. And because of this, because of their deception towards each other, they had very little success in Egypt, and they were able to capture Memphis, Egypt, not Tennessee, but they were not able to capture Alexandria. Ptolemy the seventh actually kept that. The fun and exciting part about this is that the two brothers, Ptolemy the sixth and Ptolemy the seventh, eventually do ally together and join forces and rule together. And at the end of the verse, we see God again stepping in, and the kings will only rule for an appointed time as determined by God. As it says here, end is still to come at the appointed time. So, again, who do you trust? It's hard to really tell because they were constantly deceiving each other. Not only brothers deceiving brothers, wives deceiving husbands, it's two nations deceiving each other. I mean, it's just crazy. Who do you trust? And I think, of course, as you can imagine, in any sort of poor, unhealthy relationship as these were, this deception continues and it gets worse and worse as we go on here. Let's look at verse 27. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant, and he will take action and return to his own land. The stage for the most part was set in Egypt, and so Antiochus decides to return back to his homeland, and he goes in through Palestine, which leads to the persecution of the Jewish people. He had already had some control over the Jewish people at this point of Judah. He had already had control over that region, and when he decides to return through that region on his way back to his home base, he finds there's a rebellion. The rebellion of the Jewish people against the Seleucids, trying to get them out, specifically against Antiochus IV, trying to get him and all of his horrible things that he has been doing, and to remove that from them. And again, I've referenced the Maccabees several times. So 1 Maccabees 1:16 through 28, and 2 Maccabees 5:1 through 11. Both very much tell the story about what happened. Just to give you a very, very brief overview, Antiochus IV steps in. He kills about 80,000 men, women, and children to help put down the rebellion. He looted the temple with the help of Menelaus, who is an evil high priest. So like I said, there were plenty of Jewish people on Antiochus' side, including the high priest, which of course does not bode well for the people. So this allows the temple to be looted, and that you'll see in 2 Maccabees 5:15 through 21. And at this point, the persecution of the Jews had gone beyond anything that anyone could ever possibly imagine. All right, we're gonna stop there today because we're at about an hour, and that's about all I can handle. anyways, we're going to start next week in verses 29 and finish up the book of Daniel. So we'll go from Daniel 11:29, and go all the way through that through chapter 12. And beginning in verse 29, we're going to have the second Egyptian campaign and some other things that Antiochus does. So we'll continue with the story of Antiochus, and then of course go into chapter 12 and discuss that as well. I hope everyone is well. And if you ever have any questions or comments, feel free to email me. My email is mdillingham@woodridge.org, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions or thoughts and have a conversation with you about this. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye.